All right, so now we've covered qualifying for the R&D tax credit. And if you haven't watched this video, you need to stop this one and go back and watch our qualifying for the R&D tax credit video. It's very important you understand that before you can understand how to increase your credit. So in this video, what we're going to talk about is for the projects that have met all 4 parts of the test, or even for projects that have met 2, 3, 4 parts of the test and maybe not be fully qualifying, we're going to talk about 3 simple ways that we can increase the tax credit. So by the end of this video, you should understand how to make that credit bigger and some of the variables that drive tax savings. So let's jump into those 3 tips here. Tip number 1, increase documentation. This is going to be very applicable for those companies that have a product or are in the infancy stages of developing a product or process, but don't have documentation that establishes their experimentation. What's often going to happen when you go into an analysis like ours is if you're light on establishing that process, we're going to be a little weary of increasing the amount of credit that's driven from that project. So oftentimes where clients can really benefit is in documenting exactly how they establish failure, documenting requirements and processes around validating those things. That's where we can say, you know what, this project went from a single, double kind of project to maybe a home run. That's going to require having written materials. If you're in software development, you're probably familiar with what a README file is. And essentially, that's what we're creating sometimes when we have customers or clients that are saying, what do I do? The other example within increasing documentation that helps us with the R&D tax credit is time tracking. Our ability to say that employees actually track the time on these projects is going to increase our ability to say that their salary costs fall into the R&D credit calculation. So what we've often found, just to give you an example, is we had a client who would take a survey after the year was over to show how much time they spent on R&D part of the business. And the survey came back really low. And we said, hey, the way you answered the survey got us this R&D percentage, which isn't very exciting. Doesn't really matter what it was. Let's just say it was 10% and the client expected it to be 25, 30%. So we did the following year because we said, hey, there's not much we can do about this because we can't compromise methodology. But next year, let's create an R&D code. They're already doing time tracking, where anytime you work on an R&D project or you sit on a call or you do research for a specific project that we've identified, go ahead and track your time. Well, what came back the next year is that they had almost 1,000 hours, almost 50% of their time on R&D. Now, I wasn't there for all those 1,000 hours, but the documentation we can point to is great. We can say, hey, IRS agent, we had our client track that specific time. And by doing that, and if you think about doing that throughout the organization and in the moment, the reality of R&D percentages is going to be repeatable, documentable, and something we can validate. So increasing documentation is a very important step to increasing the R&D tax credit. The second tip that we like talking about has to do with C-level involvement. And before I dive into that, let me just say that the types of tweaks that we like to make in client businesses aren't the big ones. What we like to do is change things very slightly that create a exponential growth in the output that we want. So in this case, what I'm talking about is by documenting and increasing the amount of C-level time, what we're able to do is pick up a higher R&D percentage of that executive. What that essentially means is we're picking up some of the most high salaried personnel in the organization, and we're able to increase qualifying costs by any time they spend. So even though these C-levels are very hard to get a hold of, oftentimes there is a direct relationship by tracking that time. The reason this is a great strategy is because chances are they're already spending that time. And back to tip 1, if you can begin to track that time and document it, it's going to bode very well for your business. If you happen to be in a business where development happens in a corner or it's a different functional department, you're going to want to start looking at what point does the C-level get involved? Are they a part of the quarterly meetings? Is there a monthly session? Those are the things that are going to allow us to pick up executive time. So be sure to get C-level involvement in your R&D projects. The third tip that we like to talk about is increasing technology. Now you might hear that and say, of course that's going to increase R&D. Well, let me be very specific. I think oftentimes there are things that we're doing that we call innovative that fail that technology test that we just talked about because there isn't a hard science in there. So oftentimes what I challenge clients to do is to think about how to bring hard sciences into what they're doing already. One example I have for you is we have a client that is looking at large amounts of data in Excel. And forget for a second that it might not be the most efficient way to do it, but think about how that applies for R&D. Excel does not satisfy hard science. What does is database data. So by helping a client move Excel into a database like MongoDB or start using some coding languages, what that allows us to do is to satisfy that test. And now all the work that was being done looking at data, creating research, and then using that data to make informed decisions has now become a home run from an R&D tax standpoint. The other example I like to get into is wireframing. Oftentimes we have clients that have initial ideas and concepts, and what they need to do in their situation is actually create the web application. We ask for the repository, the repo, the GitHub, the GitLab, moving a project from wireframing into actual coding, even if it's a product that's going to ultimately be scratched, will still qualify for R&D. Remember, R&D is not a process of looking at success. It's a process of looking at testing, even in the event of failures. And sometimes those failures we see with many clients are not properly documented or don't have enough technology, and they fall through the cracks on the test. To find out how you can apply these simple tips in your business, go ahead and click on the link in the description below, fill out our form, and an onboarding specialist will reach out to you today. Thank you for your time.